My name is William Anderson, and I'm 72 years old. I spent 44 years building Anderson Construction in Columbus, Ohio, starting with nothing but an old pickup truck, a toolbox, and the determination to give my family a better life. My wife, Helen, stood beside me through every setback until cancer took her away 5 years ago. After she died, the house felt unbearably quiet. That's when my two sons, Michael and Daniel, suddenly began visiting more often. They brought groceries, fixed things around the house, and insisted on taking me to doctor's appointments I could easily handle myself. At the time, I thought they were trying to fill the space their mother had left behind. Looking back, I realized they weren't taking care of me, they were preparing me for something I never saw coming. One Tuesday morning, Michael placed a brochure on my kitchen table. Across the front were the words Maple Grove Senior Living, next to a smiling couple sitting in a sunny courtyard. He calmly explained that living alone wasn't safe anymore and that they worried about me every day. Daniel agreed, saying they both had demanding careers and couldn't always rush over if something happened. I reminded them that I still drove my own truck, cooked every meal, paid every bill, and even cut my own grass. I wasn't asking them for money or daily care. I simply wanted to stay in the home where Helen and I had spent 48 years together. They listened politely, but I could tell my opinion no longer mattered. Their decision had already been made before they ever asked what I wanted. 3 weeks later, Daniel drove me to Maple Grove with a single suitcase in the back seat. Inside were a few clothes, my family photo album, and Helen's wedding ring wrapped in a white handkerchief. Michael handled the paperwork while a receptionist handed me a key to room 214. Before leaving, they both hugged me and promised they'd be back the following weekend. Michael even joked that we'd go out for my favorite cheeseburger once I settled in. I stood by the front window and watched their SUV disappear down the driveway, believing I'd see them again in just a few days. The first weekend came and went. Then another. Every afternoon, I sat near the lobby window, convincing myself the next black SUV turning into the parking lot would be theirs. 6 weeks passed before my phone finally buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a text from Michael. I smiled as I opened it, expecting an apology or a date for their visit. Instead, I read words that hit harder than anything I'd experienced in my 72 years. "Dad, please stop calling us. We're trying to live our own lives." I stared at the screen until it went dark. In that single moment, I understood something I had refused to believe for weeks. My sons hadn't forgotten about me. They had chosen to leave me behind. What they didn't know was that they had walked away from far more than an old man sitting in a nursing home. The first few weeks at Maple Grove passed so slowly that I stopped looking at the calendar. Every morning followed the same routine. Breakfast at 7, medication at 8, a few hours of television that nobody really watched, and lunch with people who rarely spoke about the future. Most conversations were about old memories, children who never visited, or friends who had quietly disappeared. I kept my phone in my shirt pocket all day, turning the screen on every few minutes even when I knew there wouldn't be a new message. Every ringtone I heard made my heart jump, only to remind me that it belonged to someone else. I told myself Michael and Daniel were busy, but deep down I already knew the truth. They had continued with their lives exactly as they wanted, and I was no longer part of them. One afternoon, a young nurse named Emily Carter noticed me sitting alone near the window overlooking the parking lot. Instead of asking the usual questions about my medication or blood pressure, she simply sat beside me and asked what I used to do before retiring. It was the first genuine conversation I'd had in weeks. I told her about Anderson Construction, the freezing winters spent pouring concrete before sunrise, and how my wife used to bring coffee to the crews every Christmas Eve. Emily smiled as if those stories actually mattered. Before walking away, she quietly said, "Mr. Anderson, people don't build companies like that unless they're stronger than they realize." Those words stayed with me longer than she could have imagined. For the first time since arriving, someone saw me as more than another elderly man waiting for visitors who never came. That evening I opened the small photo album I'd brought from home. There was a picture of Michael and Daniel sitting on the hood of my first pickup truck, both covered in sawdust after insisting they wanted to help me at work. Helen had laughed while taking that picture because neither of them had lifted a single board all day. Looking at their smiling faces, I couldn't understand where those boys had gone. Somewhere between childhood and success, they had learned to measure people by convenience instead of love. I closed the album and slipped Helen's wedding ring back into my pocket. It was the one thing I still carried every day, a reminder of promises that had actually been kept. The next morning, just as I finished my coffee, the receptionist walked toward me holding a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. "This was delivered by courier," she said. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but in the upper left corner was the name of a law office I hadn't seen in years. My hands trembled as I slowly opened the envelope, completely unaware that the papers inside were about to reveal a secret my sons never imagined still existed. I stared at the envelope for nearly a minute before opening it. The return address belonged to Whitmore and Pierce Attorneys at Law, a firm I hadn't contacted since the year I retired. The name printed beneath it stopped me cold, **Sarah Whitmore **. She had been my company's attorney for almost 20 years and knew every contract, every property, and every important decision I'd ever made. I unfolded the letter and read the first sentence twice. Mr. Anderson, I have been trying to reach you regarding a confidential matter involving your estate and a trust agreement that requires your immediate attention. My first thought was that there had to be some mistake. I had signed my will years ago, shortly after Helen passed away. As far as I knew, everything had already been settled. Before I could finish reading, the receptionist walked over and said, "Mr. Anderson, there's someone on the phone asking for you." I picked up the receiver, and within seconds I recognized Sarah's calm, professional voice. She apologized for not finding me sooner and explained that all of her recent letters had been mailed to my old house. Since no one had responded, she hired a courier to locate me personally. Then her tone changed. "Bill," she said quietly, "I need you to answer one question honestly. Have you signed any legal documents since moving into Maple Grove?" I told her I hadn't signed anything except the admission forms on the day my sons brought me there. She paused for several seconds before saying something that made my stomach tighten. "Good. That means we're not too late." Sarah explained that while reviewing old company records, she had discovered a forgotten trust agreement created nearly 15 years earlier during a major business restructuring. At the time, it was designed to protect the company and several properties if anything unexpected ever happened to me. After Helen became ill, we focused on her treatment, and the trust slipped into the background. According to Sarah, it had never been revoked, and some of its conditions were still legally active. Even more surprising, several recent requests have been made to access documents connected to that trust. Those requests hadn't come from me. They had come from someone claiming to act on my behalf. After ending the call, I sat motionless with the letter resting on my lap. For weeks, I had believed my greatest loss was my family. Now I realized something far more unsettling. Someone had been digging through my legal affairs without my knowledge, and Sarah sounded convinced it wasn't an accident. As I looked out the window toward the empty parking lot, one thought refused to leave my mind. If my sons believed everything already belonged to them, why were they trying so hard to find documents they were never supposed to know existed? I barely slept that night. Sarah's words echoed in my mind over and over. We're not too late. I kept wondering what she had discovered that sounded so urgent. Early the next morning, she arrived at Maple Grove carrying a thick leather briefcase that looked just as worn as the one she'd carried into my office years earlier. The moment she sat down across from me, I could tell this wasn't an ordinary visit. She didn't waste time with small talk. Instead, she placed several folders on the table and looked me straight in the eye. "Bill," she said, "before I show you these documents, I need you to promise me something." No matter how shocked you are, don't contact your sons until we've confirmed every detail. She opened the first folder and slid a stack of property records toward me. I immediately recognized the addresses. They included the land where my company had built its first warehouse, 2 commercial buildings downtown, and a small piece of farmland Helen and I had bought decades earlier. I remembered transferring those assets into a protective trust during a lawsuit many years ago, but I had completely forgotten that they were still held under that arrangement. Sarah pointed to several highlighted pages. During the past 6 months, someone had repeatedly requested certified copies of those records. The requests weren't illegal, but they were unusual. Even more troubling, the paperwork listed my eldest son, Michael, as the person seeking information through a private legal service. My heart sank, but Sarah wasn't finished. She handed me another document showing recent attempts to verify my signature against older company records. Whoever made those requests appeared to be preparing paperwork that would become effective only after my death. They're planning ahead, Sarah said quietly. We don't know exactly why yet, but this isn't normal estate planning. Someone is trying to understand every asset connected to your name before you're even gone. I stared at the papers, unable to believe the same boys I had spent my life protecting were now investigating my finances without telling me. The painful text message suddenly made much more sense. They hadn't asked me to stop calling because they wanted peace. They wanted distance. As Sarah packed the files back into her briefcase, she smiled for the first time that morning. There's one thing they still don't know, she said. The trust contains a clause that has never been activated, and only you can decide whether it stays exactly as it is, or changes everything. I looked down at Helen's wedding ring resting in my hand and slowly nodded. For the first time since arriving at Maple Grove, I wasn't thinking about what my sons had taken from me. I was thinking about what they had never truly owned in the first place. After Sarah left, I sat alone in my room for nearly an hour, staring at the folders she had shown me. I kept asking myself the same question: when did my sons stop seeing me as their father and start seeing me as an inheritance? I wanted to call Michael and demand an explanation. I wanted to ask Daniel why they had abandoned me after everything Helen and I had sacrificed for them. But Sarah had been clear. If I confronted them too soon, they would become careful. People who believe they're about to inherit millions don't panic until they realize the plan has changed. For the first time in my life, I decided not to react with emotion. I would wait, listen, and let the truth reveal itself. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah quietly began investigating. She contacted old accountants, reviewed company archives, and requested records from the county clerk's office. Every few days she called with another small piece of the puzzle. Michael had been asking questions about commercial properties that hadn't been discussed in years. Daniel had contacted a real estate broker to estimate the value of land that was still legally protected by the trust. Neither of them actually owned those assets, yet both were acting as if it was only a matter of time before everything became theirs. The more Sarah uncovered, the clearer the picture became. They weren't planning for my future, they were planning for a future without me. Meanwhile, life at Maple Grove slowly changed. I stopped spending every afternoon staring out the lobby window. Instead, I joined Frank Miller for coffee after breakfast and found myself laughing at stories I never expected to hear. Emily noticed the difference immediately. "You look lighter," she said one morning. I smiled and told her she was probably imagining things. The truth was, I finally understood that waiting for my sons to return was only keeping me trapped in the past. They had already made their decision. Now it was time for me to make mine. Late one Friday afternoon, Sarah called again. Her voice was calm, but I could hear excitement beneath it. "Bill," she said, "I found something they definitely don't know exists. If I'm right, the trust gives you one final option that can change every dollar they expect to receive." I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking about Helen and the promise I'd made to always protect what we built together. Then I quietly answered, "Tell me everything." Sarah took a deep breath before saying words that would become the turning point of my entire life. This isn't just about your estate anymore, it's about a clause no one has touched in 15 years. The following Monday, Sarah arrived with a sealed binder that looked older than I remembered. She placed it on the table between us and carefully opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, Anderson Family Legacy Trust. My own signature appeared at the bottom of the page, dated nearly 15 years earlier. I remembered creating the trust during a difficult lawsuit when a competitor tried to force my company into bankruptcy. Back then, Sarah insisted we build strong legal protections around the business in case anything unexpected happened. Once the lawsuit ended and life returned to normal, I never thought about those papers again. Now they had become the most important documents I owned. Sarah pointed to a section buried deep inside the agreement. Most people never read this far, she said with a small smile. But this clause is still valid. The language was simple enough for me to understand. If any beneficiary intentionally abandoned, manipulated, or attempted to gain control of trust assets through deception before the trust officially matured, that beneficiary could lose the right to inherit. The assets would then be redistributed according to the trustee's final instructions. I looked at Sarah in disbelief. Are you telling me this has been here all these years? She nodded. Yes, Bill. And based on everything we've uncovered, your sons may have triggered exactly what this clause was designed to prevent. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. My first instinct wasn't revenge. It was sadness. I remembered teaching Michael how to ride a bicycle and helping Daniel build his first treehouse in the backyard. Helen and I had worked our entire lives so they would never worry about money, yet somewhere along the way they had started believing they were entitled to everything before I was even gone. Sarah gently closed the binder and reminded me that no decision had been made yet. You still have complete control, she said. Nothing changes unless you choose to act. That sentence stayed with me long after she left. For the first time in weeks, I realized my future wasn't being decided by my sons. It was still being decided by me. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees outside Maple Grove, my phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar. I answered without thinking. After a brief silence, I heard a voice I hadn't expected to hear in months. Dad, it's Michael. He sounded unusually calm, almost nervous. Then he asked a question that made my heart sink. Has anyone from your old law office been in touch with you? In that instant, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. My sons weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because they had finally realized something had gone terribly wrong. I didn't answer Michael's question right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the small garden behind Maple Grove. For months, he had ignored every call I made. Every voicemail had gone unanswered, every birthday message had been forgotten, and the only text I'd received was the one asking me to stop calling. Now, suddenly, he wanted to know whether my attorney had contacted me. The silence between us lasted several seconds before I finally replied, "Why would you ask me that?" Michael hesitated. "No reason," he said quickly. "I just heard Sarah Whitmore might be updating some old company records." His voice sounded calm, but I knew my son well enough to recognize when he was nervous. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," I told him. "Funny how people find time to call when they're worried about paperwork." He laughed awkwardly and tried to change the subject, asking how I was feeling and whether Maple Grove was treating me well. The question sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced them before dialing my number. I answered politely but briefly. Then, before hanging up, he said something that confirmed everything Sarah had suspected. "Daniel and I were thinking about visiting this weekend." I almost smiled. Nearly 3 months had passed without a single visit, yet now they suddenly had free time. It wasn't guilt that brought them back. It was fear. The next morning, Sarah called before breakfast. "I was expecting that phone call," she said after I told her about my conversation with Michael. She explained that her office had formally notified both of my sons that a mandatory legal review of the Anderson Family Legacy Trust would take place the following Friday. The notice didn't explain why. It simply required every listed beneficiary to attend in person. "They're nervous because they don't know what we've found," Sarah said. "People who think they understand an estate become very uncomfortable when lawyers start asking questions." She paused for a moment before adding, "Bill, whatever happens in that meeting, let them do the talking first. Sometimes people reveal more when they believe they can still control the situation." Friday arrived faster than I expected. Sarah called just before noon to confirm that both Michael and Daniel had accepted the meeting without asking many questions. According to her assistant, they sounded confident, almost impatient, as if they expected to sign a few papers and leave with good news. They had no idea the meeting wasn't about giving them anything. It was about discovering what they had already tried to take. As I ended the call, Sarah quietly said, "By this time next week, your sons will finally understand that abandoning their father was the most expensive mistake of their lives." Those words echoed in my mind as I looked at Helen's wedding ring resting in my palm. For the first time since I walked into Maple Grove, I wasn't waiting for my sons anymore. I didn't answer Michael's question right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the small garden behind Maple Grove. For months, he had ignored every call I made. Every voicemail had gone unanswered, every birthday message had been forgotten, and the only text I'd received was the one asking me to stop calling. Now, suddenly, he wanted to know whether my attorney had contacted me. The silence between us lasted several seconds before I finally replied, "Why would you ask me that?" Michael hesitated. "No reason," he said quickly. "I just heard Sarah Whitmore might be updating some old company records." His voice sounded calm, but I knew my son well enough to recognize when he was nervous. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," I told him. "Funny how people find time to call when they're worried about paperwork." He laughed awkwardly and tried to change the subject, asking how I was feeling and whether Maple Grove was treating me well. The questions sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced them before dialing my number. I answered politely but briefly. Then, before hanging up, he said something that confirmed everything Sarah had suspected. "Daniel and I were thinking about visiting this weekend." I almost smiled. Nearly 3 months had passed without a single visit, yet now they suddenly had free time. It wasn't guilt that brought them back. It was fear. The next morning, Sarah called before breakfast. "I was expecting that phone call," she said after I told her about my conversation with Michael. She explained that her office had formally notified both of my sons that a mandatory legal review of the Anderson Family Legacy Trust would take place the following Friday. The notice didn't explain why. It simply required every listed beneficiary to attend in person. "They're nervous because they don't know what we've found," Sarah said. "People who think they understand an estate become very uncomfortable when lawyers start asking questions." She paused for a moment before adding, "Bill, whatever happens in that meeting, let them do the talking first. Sometimes people reveal more when they believe they can still control the situation." Friday arrived faster than I expected. Sarah called just before noon to confirm that both Michael and Daniel had accepted the meeting without asking many questions. According to her assistant, they sounded confident, almost impatient, as if they expected to sign a few papers and leave with good news. They had no idea the meeting wasn't about giving them anything. It was about discovering what they had already tried to take. As I ended the call, Sarah quietly said, "By this time next week, your sons will finally understand that abandoning their father was the most expensive mistake of their lives." Those words echoed in my mind as I looked at Helen's wedding ring resting in my palm. For the first time since I walked into Maple Grove, I wasn't waiting for my sons anymore. The conference room at Whitmore and Pierce overlooked downtown Columbus, a view I had admired many times during my years in business. This time, however, it felt completely different. I arrived early with Sarah and quietly took my seat at the far end of the polished oak table. A thick binder rested in front of every chair, but each one remained closed. Sarah had asked me to let her handle the meeting, and I intended to keep that promise. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. Michael walked in first, wearing an expensive navy suit with the confidence of a man who believed he already knew the outcome. Daniel followed a few steps behind, carrying the same easy smile I remembered from his real estate advertisements. The moment they saw me sitting there, both stopped in surprise. For a brief second, neither of them said a word. Then Michael forced a smile and asked, "Dad, you're here?" I simply nodded. "Apparently, so are you." After everyone was seated, Sarah closed the conference room door and began speaking. "Thank you for attending. Today's meeting concerns the Anderson Family Legacy Trust and several recent activities connected to it." Michael leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, acting as though this were a routine legal review. Daniel casually reached for the binder in front of him, but Sarah stopped him. "Please leave the documents closed until I ask you to open them." The room instantly grew quiet. She continued by explaining that her office had recently completed an audit of trust records, company archives, and property filings. During that review, they discovered multiple requests for confidential documents submitted over the previous several months. Each request involved assets that remained protected under the trust. Sarah didn't accuse anyone directly. Instead, she calmly placed copies of the requests on the table and slid them toward my sons. Michael's confidence faded as he recognized his own law firm's letterhead attached to several of the requests. Daniel picked up another document, his smile disappearing as he realized his name appeared on correspondence with a commercial real estate broker discussing property values connected to the trust. Neither of them looked at me. They kept staring at the paperwork, silently hoping there was an explanation that would somehow make everything disappear. Finally, Michael cleared his throat and said, "We were only trying to understand Dad's estate so we could help him in the future." Sarah didn't argue. She simply opened the master binder and turned to a bookmarked page. "That explanation would be more convincing," she replied, "if these requests hadn't begun just days after Mr. Anderson was admitted to Maple Grove." Sarah looked around the room before speaking one final sentence. "This meeting isn't about distributing an inheritance. It's about determining whether the actions taken by certain beneficiaries have already violated the trust agreement." Michael was the first to break the silence. He pushed the binder away and looked directly at Sarah. "Are you accusing us of something?" His voice was steady, but I could hear the tension beneath it. Daniel quickly joined in, insisting they had only been trying to understand my estate so they could help manage things when the time came. Sarah listened without interrupting. When they finished, she calmly slid another folder across the table. Inside were copies of emails, property inquiries, and requests for confidential trust records dating back several months. Every document had a date, a signature, and a clear trail leading back to them. "This isn't about curiosity," Sarah said. "This is about intent." For the first time since the meeting began, Michael looked at me instead of the paperwork. "Dad," he said, "you know we'd never try to hurt you." His words might have meant something if they had been spoken months earlier, before the unanswered phone calls, before the lonely nights at Maple Grove, and before the message telling me to stop calling them. I met his eyes and asked a single question. "If your attorney hadn't called you, would either of you be sitting in this room today?" Neither of them answered. Daniel lowered his head, while Michael stared silently at the table. Their silence said more than any explanation ever could. Sarah then turned to the final section of the trust agreement. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "under Section 12, you have complete authority to amend the distribution of every protected asset before the trust becomes irrevocable." She placed a fountain pen beside the document. "The decision is entirely yours." My hands rested on the table as I looked at the signatures Helen and I had placed on those papers 15 years earlier. We created that trust to protect our family, never imagining it might one day protect us from our own children. I wasn't thinking about punishment. I was thinking about responsibility. Wealth was never meant to reward greed. It was meant to preserve the values that created it. I picked up the pen and signed the amendment without saying a word. Sarah quietly collected the papers and placed them back inside the binder. Michael immediately stood up. "What did you just sign?" he demanded. Sarah closed the folder and looked at both brothers. "The amendment will become effective immediately," she replied. "You'll each receive certified copies after they're filed with the court this afternoon." Daniel's face turned pale. "How much changed?" he asked. Sarah paused before answering. "Enough that neither of you should assume anything about your inheritance anymore." As the brothers stared at each other in disbelief, I realized the meeting wasn't the end of the story. It was only the moment they finally understood they had lost control, and they still had no idea where my life's work was about to go. The news spread through the room faster than anyone expected. Michael's face was pale, while Daniel paced back and forth as though walking could somehow change what had just happened. Sarah remained perfectly calm. She waited until the room was silent before opening the final section of the binder. "Since the amendment has been signed," she said, "I believe it's time everyone understands what Mr. Anderson has decided." She handed each of my sons a copy of the revised trust summary. I watched them scan the first page, their confidence disappearing line by line. They weren't reading the future they had imagined. They were reading the consequences of their own choices. The first surprise was that Anderson Construction would never belong entirely to either of them. Instead, ownership would be transferred into an employee trust managed by a professional board. Hundreds of men and women had spent decades helping me build that company. Some had worked beside me longer than my own sons had shown interest in the business. They deserved stability long after I was gone. The commercial properties would be placed under a charitable foundation that would fund trade school scholarships for young people who wanted to learn construction but couldn't afford college. Helen had always believed that giving someone a skill was better than giving them money, and I wanted her kindness to live on through every student who received that opportunity. Michael finally looked up from the papers. "You're giving everything away?" he asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. I slowly shook my head. "No," I answered. "I'm giving it to the people who never walked away." The room fell silent again. I explained that wealth wasn't simply about blood or last names. It was about loyalty, honesty, and showing up when someone needed you. The employees who stood beside me during recessions, the friends who never stopped calling after Helen died, and the people at Maple Grove who treated me with dignity had reminded me what family truly looked like. Money couldn't repair broken relationships, but it could protect the values that built those relationships in the first place. Just as Sarah began collecting the documents, her assistant knocked on the conference room door and quietly handed her another envelope marked, "Priority Delivery." Sarah opened it, read the first page, and her expression immediately changed. She looked directly at me before turning toward my sons. "It appears," she said slowly, "that this meeting isn't over after all." Michael frowned. "What now?" Sarah placed the letter on the table. "We've just received evidence from someone outside this room, evidence that explains exactly what happened in the weeks before Mr. Anderson was admitted to Maple Grove." The moment I saw the name signed at the bottom of the statement, I realized someone had finally decided to tell the truth, and that truth was about to change everything once again. Sarah slowly removed the document from the envelope and placed it on the conference table. "This statement was delivered this morning by a former employee of Anderson Construction," she said. "He requested that it remain sealed until today's meeting." Michael shifted uneasily in his chair while Daniel folded his arms, trying to appear calm. Sarah adjusted her glasses and began reading. The statement came from Richard Collins, the company's retired chief financial officer, a man who had worked beside me for more than 30 years. Richard wrote that a few months after Helen's funeral, Michael had contacted him privately, asking detailed questions about my assets, the company, and the trust. At first, Richard believed Michael was simply trying to understand the family business. But the conversations became increasingly focused on what would happen after my death rather than how to help me while I was alive. The statement continued with details that even I hadn't known. Richard explained that both of my sons had repeatedly asked whether the company could be sold quickly once they inherited it. They wanted estimates of the buildings, equipment, and land, not because they planned to continue my life's work, but because they wanted to divide the money and move on. When Richard refused to share confidential financial records, they stopped contacting him altogether. He admitted that he had stayed silent because he hoped they would come to their senses. Instead, after learning I had been moved to Maple Grove, he realized their interest had only grown stronger. That's why he decided to come forward. Mr. Anderson deserved honesty, the final line read. If I remained silent any longer, I would be betraying the man who gave me a career and treated me like family. The room was silent. Michael finally stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Dad, we made mistakes," he said quietly. "But we never wanted things to end like this." Daniel nodded in agreement, but neither of them denied what Richard had written. Their silence confirmed everything. I looked at both of them for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know what hurts the most?" I asked. "It isn't the money. It isn't the company. It's that you had months to visit me, to sit with me, to ask how I was doing, and you chose not to. The only thing that brought you back into my life was the fear of losing an inheritance. Neither of them could meet my eyes." Sarah carefully closed the binder and stood up. "The trust amendment has now been filed with the court," she said. "From this moment forward, Mr. Anderson's decisions are legally protected and cannot be challenged on the grounds presented today." Michael lowered his head, while Daniel quietly walked toward the door. Before either of them left, I stopped them with one final sentence. "I hope one day you understand that I never wanted to leave you less money. I wanted you to become better men." They walked out without another word. After Michael and Daniel walked out of the conference room, the silence no longer felt heavy. For months, I had carried anger, disappointment, and questions that had no answers. Now, for the first time since Helen died, I felt something unexpected: peace. Sarah quietly placed a small envelope in front of me. The moment I saw the handwriting, my heart stopped. It belonged to Helen. She had written the letter years earlier, shortly after we created the Anderson Family Legacy Trust. Sarah explained that Helen had asked her to keep it sealed until the day I faced the hardest decision of my life. She believed that if our family ever fell apart, her words should guide me instead of my emotions. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands. "My dear Bill," it began. If you're reading this, it means life didn't happen the way we hoped. Please don't spend your remaining years chasing people who only remember your value when they need something from you. We didn't build our lives just to leave money behind. We built them to leave kindness, honesty, and opportunity. If our children lose sight of those values, don't punish them with anger. Simply protect what we created and place it where it can continue doing good. Real love can never be bought with an inheritance. By the time I reached the last sentence, tears blurred the page. Even after she was gone, Helen somehow knew exactly what I would need to hear. A month later, the revised trust officially took effect. Anderson Construction became an employee-owned company, giving the people who had stood beside me for decades the chance to protect its future. Helen's Scholarship Foundation began helping young men and women learn skilled trades, creating opportunities for families who needed them most. Life at Maple Grove no longer felt like the end of my journey. Emily still checked on me every morning, Frank never missed our afternoon coffee, and I finally stopped waiting by the window for visitors who had already chosen another path. Instead of counting the days behind me, I started appreciating the ones I still had ahead. Nearly a year passed before 2 handwritten letters arrived in the mail. One was from Michael. The other was from Daniel. Neither asked for money. Neither mentioned the inheritance. They simply apologized for confusing success with entitlement and admitted they had forgotten the values their mother had tried so hard to teach them. I folded both letters, placed them beside Helen's photograph, and smiled. Some lessons arrive too late, but they're still worth learning. As the sun set over Columbus that evening, I realized my greatest legacy was never the company I built or the fortune I earned. It was the example Helen and I left behind. Money can be inherited. Character cannot. And in the end, that's the only inheritance that truly lasts.